I realized something was terribly wrong the moment the young nurse tilted her head toward me and whispered, "Your son said you're confused and getting worse, that you might not have much time." For a second, my breath left me, as if someone had placed a cold hand on the back of my neck. I'm 74, yes, and I've had my scares in life, but I've never been confused. Not once. I've kept bills, memories, and people in order far better than most half my age. And dying? No one had said a word about that until now. The nurse stood there with the chart hugged to her chest, smiling gently, the way they do when they speak to someone fragile. It took everything in me not to snap at her. She meant well. She always did. But the words she'd repeated, my son's words, stung like salt in an open cut. I lay still in that narrow hospital bed, feeling the stiffness in my left arm, the dull pulsing near my temple where the minor stroke had brushed past me 2 days earlier. I could accept the weakness, the dizziness, the doctors fussing over me. What I could not accept was the idea that Daniel had walked through these halls and told strangers that his mother's mind was slipping away. "Who told you that?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. My voice had always been steady, even when Daniel was a boy throwing tantrums on the kitchen floor. The nurse hesitated, glanced toward the hallway, then back at me, lowering her voice. "Your son said you might not remember conversations clearly. He said it would help if we contacted him for decisions." Decisions, my name on the forms, my life. A strange heaviness settled in my chest, slow and suffocating. Daniel had always liked being in control, but he'd never crossed into this territory before. At least I never allowed myself to see it if he had. The nurse reached for the cup of water on my tray. "Do you need help drinking, Mrs. Hale?" I shook my head, perhaps too sharply because she blinked. "No," I said. "I'm capable." She apologized softly, but the damage was done. I could feel it, the subtle shift of how they viewed me, as if I were fading, as if I were becoming someone unreliable. I asked her what else my son had said. She hesitated again. I watched her weigh her duty against her empathy. "He told us not to worry if you asked to go home. He said he changed the locks while you were here, so you wouldn't wander." I stared at her, waiting for her to laugh, to smile, to admit she'd misheard. But she looked back at me with that same gentle worry, and I felt something old and iron-hard rise inside me. Daniel had changed the locks on my house, the house I paid for, the house where I raised him, the house where I kept every letter his father ever wrote me. "Are you sure?" I asked quietly. She nodded. "He said it was for your safety." My safety. That was the excuse people used when they wanted to take a piece of your life while pretending they were doing you a kindness. I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling the sterile air move across my cheeks. The nurse tucked the blanket around me and said something about lunch trays, but I barely heard her. My mind was too loud. My son had made decisions about me without me. He had changed my locks. He had spoken for me. And he had lied. The kind of lie that doesn't come from panic or misunderstanding. The kind that requires planning. When the nurse finally left, I stared at the ceiling, the pale hospital light buzzing faintly above me. I thought of Daniel as a boy, sitting on the floor with his toy trucks. I thought of how easily love can blind you to things you don't want to see. I thought of my keys, now worthless metal in my purse, and my home standing locked against me. For the first time in my life, I felt something break quietly inside, then settle into a steady, unshakable place. Whatever Daniel had started outside these walls, he wasn't going to finish without me. And I wasn't done yet. When the doctor came in that morning, adjusting his glasses and scanning my chart, I could tell he was preparing to speak slowly, the way people talk when they believe your mind is fraying. "Mrs. Hale," he said gently, "your son mentioned you've been feeling disoriented at home. Has that been happening often?" I stared at him, not with anger, just a long, quiet look that made him shift in place. "No," I said. "It has not." It was strange, almost surreal, hearing someone try to hand me a version of my life that wasn't mine. I'd lived alone for 11 years without a single incident. I paid my bills on time, drove myself to the store, remembered birthdays, medication schedules, and every small favor people asked of me. Confusion was never my companion, but I didn't argue, not yet. Arguing too early makes you look exactly the way they already decided you are. I remembered the day I arrived here. The ambulance lights were too bright for my eyes, but I'd been aware of every movement, every question. The pain in my arm had been sharp, traveling up to my jaw, and I'd known something was wrong. Daniel had come rushing into the hospital hours later, smelling of expensive cologne, talking too loudly in the hallway, as if performing concern for an audience. He had touched my shoulder and said, "You gave us quite a scare, Mom." But he hadn't stayed long. He'd left after 15 minutes, saying he had meetings. Meetings were always the reason he came late and left early. I didn't think much of it then. I was simply grateful he'd come. Now, lying in this bed, his short visit took on a different weight. He must have spoken to the nurses and doctors afterward, when I was too tired to listen or ask. He must have used that window to start shaping a story that didn't belong to me. When the doctor stepped out, a social worker came in, a polite woman with a clipboard pressed tight to her stomach. "I'm here to check on how you're coping," she said, taking the chair near my bed. "Your son mentioned you may need support making decisions during recovery." There it was again, decisions. The word kept following me through the room like a shadow someone else controlled. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend myself. Instead, I folded my hands over the thin blanket. "What exactly did my son tell you?" I asked. She read something from her notes, her brow tightening. "He said you've been having memory lapses. He expressed concern that you sometimes forget where you are. He reported that you wander at night." Wander. I could have laughed if it hadn't been so grotesque. At home, I locked my doors every evening, double-checking each one. Wander. The farthest I'd traveled at night was from my bedroom to the bathroom. But again, I didn't explain. The time for explanations would come later, when I had something firmer than indignation in my hands. Instead, I asked, "And did he mention any examples?" The woman hesitated, flipping through her notes. "No specific ones, just general concerns." Her tone softened. "Sometimes children struggle to see their parents aging. They may overreact." "This isn't overreacting," I said quietly. "This is rewriting." She looked at me more carefully then, as if the fog she'd been told to expect simply wasn't there. She asked a few orientation questions, my address, today's date, the name of the president. I answered each one without hesitation. She nodded slowly, a crease forming between her eyebrows. "May I ask," she said, choosing her words, "has your son ever handled your legal decisions?" "No," I answered. "He has not." She made a note, one she didn't let me see, but her posture changed, more alert, less certain about the story she'd been given. After she left, I stared at the window for a long time. Outside, the parking lot glimmered under the cold sun. Cars came and went. People came and went. Life moved normally for everyone except me, lying in this stiff bed, being slowly painted into a corner I never stepped into. I thought of Daniel as an adult, successful on paper, always talking about opportunities, investments, renovations. He'd asked me for help many times over the years, and I'd given it because that's what mothers do. But there had always been a thin line between asking and taking, and I sensed, deep down, that he had crossed it long before this hospital stay. Now he wasn't asking anymore. He was claiming. Later that day, when the evening nurse checked my vitals and adjusted the pillows, I asked her, "Has my son called?" She looked uncomfortable. "He phoned earlier," she said carefully, "but he asked us to contact him directly about all updates. He said you might forget to pass things along." I thanked her, though my throat felt tight. I remembered my house exactly as I'd left it 2 days ago. Keys in my purse, porch light off, kettle on the stove. Nothing confused, nothing chaotic. I remembered every detail, and I knew, with a clarity sharper than the ache in my arm, that none of this was a misunderstanding. Something deliberate was unfolding. I just didn't yet know why. I lay back against the pillow, letting the quiet settle around me. The hospital hallway hummed faintly, a low, mechanical sound. I clicked the call button off and folded my hands once more. Whatever Daniel was constructing, he was doing it without expecting resistance. He'd forgotten who raised him. And he'd forgotten that I'm still here, just not for long on his terms. That night in the hospital, sleep refused to come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the nurse's uneasy smile, the social worker's clipboard pressed tight to her chest, the doctor's softened tone as if he were handling glass. They were all looking at me through Daniel's words, not through their own eyes. That was the part that bothered me most. Not the insult, not even the lies, though each lie felt like a stone placed carefully on my chest, but the fact that people believed him before they bothered looking at me. Near midnight, the hallway quieted. Machines hummed. A cleaning cart squeaked past my door. I turned on the dim lamp above my bed and studied the small whiteboard where they'd written, "Orientation checks recommended." Under it, "Contact son for updates." Those 2 sentences told me more than anything they had said out loud. I pressed the nurse call button. When the night nurse appeared, a soft-spoken man named Henry, I asked him plainly, "Why did the team add orientation checks to my board?" He hesitated. "Your son expressed concerns," he said finally. "We have to take family reports seriously." "Do I seem disoriented to you?" I asked. He looked at me, really looked for the first time. His eyes softened with something like apology. "No," he said, "you don't." When he left, I reached for my purse on the bedside chair. My fingers brushed over my keys, my house key, still taped with a small red sticker I'd added years ago to distinguish it from the mailbox key. That key opened the door to my kitchen, where the clock above the sink ticked softly every night. That key opened the door to my small back porch, where Daniel once helped me plant hydrangeas. That key had never failed me, but now, according to the nurse, it opened nothing. The thought made me sit straighter in the bed. My heart wasn't racing, just working harder, like a long-neglected muscle trying to remind itself of its purpose. I held the key between my fingers until my hand grew tired. A small, solid piece of my life, and now meaningless because my son had turned it into a dead object. I placed it back in my purse and closed the zipper. In the morning, I made a decision. Not a dramatic one. Those belong to people who live loudly. Mine was quiet, the kind that settles into your bones and stays there. I decided I would collect information. I would ask questions without showing that I was asking. I would observe the way the staff talked to me, the way they talked about me. My life was being rewritten, and if someone was writing a false story, I wanted every page. During breakfast, the social worker returned. She tried to hide her careful glances, but I saw each one. "Did my son mention when he last visited the house?" I asked, stirring my oatmeal though I wasn't hungry. She blinked, caught off guard. "He said you'd become anxious at home, that you sometimes misplace items and accuse people of moving them." Accuse people. I let that sit in the air for a long moment. "Did he bring any proof?" I asked. She shifted in her chair. "No, but family accounts are important to consider." "Important? Yes, but not infallible." She cleared her throat. "You should know he asked about longer-term care options. He said he wanted you somewhere safe." Safe. There was that word again. A word that too often means out of the way. I kept my face calm, but something inside me tightened, slow and steady. "Did he ask before or after speaking to the doctor?" She checked her notes. Before? Before? Meaning he hadn't even waited for a medical recommendation. After she left, I asked one more question. To the nurse delivering my medication. "Do you have the notes from when my son checked in with staff on the first day?" The nurse hesitated. "I can't show them, but I can ask someone from administration to speak with you." "Please do," I said. Later, a middle-aged administrator with a stiff walk appeared at my door with a folder tucked under his arm. He didn't show me the contents, but he summarized them. And each sentence he read sounded like a verdict written in advance. "Your son reported increasing confusion at home. Your son stated you've wandered outside at night. Your son mentioned you may not remember important conversations. Your son requested we contact him first for care decisions. Your son said he had changed the locks for safety." Each phrase built a cage that didn't fit me. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, he said, "We take family concerns seriously, Mrs. Hale, but we also take patient autonomy seriously. If something is inaccurate, we will document your statement." "Good," I said. "Please document this." "None of those claims are true." He nodded slowly. "I will note your correction." After he left, the silence in the room felt different, not empty, but waiting. I lay back and let the cool air from the vent brush across my forehead. The truth was clear now. Daniel wasn't mistaken. He wasn't confused. He wasn't panicked. He was preparing something. And if he thought I would slip quietly into the version of me he'd described, he had forgotten everything about the woman who raised him. I may have been lying in a hospital bed, but my mind had never been sharper, and I intended to use it. By the next afternoon, the hospital felt smaller, as if the walls had moved closer during the night. I'd spent hours replaying the same sentence the nurse had whispered. "Your son said he changed the locks so you wouldn't wander." That wasn't just concern. That was intention. And it was becoming impossible to pretend otherwise. When the day nurse came in to take my vitals, she spoke with that same polite carefulness I was growing used to. She tightened the blood pressure cuff around my arm and said lightly, "Your son called again. He asked us to remind you he'll handle things at home until you're fully stable." Stable. Another word reshaped to fit someone else's story. I didn't answer. I simply asked, "When did he say that?" "About an hour ago," she replied. "He said he was going back to your house after work to finish a few tasks." Tasks. My house. My locks. My life. When she left, I pushed myself upright and breathed slowly until the dizziness eased. I'd been patient enough. It was time to hear the truth from someone who had no reason to lie. I pressed the call button. Henry, the night nurse, appeared even though it was daytime. He must have been finishing a shift. "Can I help you, Mrs. Hale?" "Yes," I said. "Tell me exactly what my son said when he first came here." He hesitated, But something in my voice must have told him I didn't want soothing. I wanted facts. He told us you'd had several episodes of confusion, Henry said quietly, and that you might get upset if we asked too many questions. He suggested we limit your involvement in decisions for a few days. Limit my involvement. The phrase hit harder than anything else. My own son, deciding when I should speak, what I should sign, what I should know. I felt a slow burn travel through my chest. Not anger in the loud sense, but something steady and old, like embers that had been waiting for dry air. Did he say anything about my house? I asked. Henry looked uncomfortable. He said he'd taken precautions. He didn't specify, but he implied the home environment wasn't safe for you right now. So he had said it, without shame, without hesitation. He'd told an entire medical team that the home I had kept intact for decades was dangerous, not because of broken steps or faulty wiring, but because of me. I thanked Henry and asked him to close the door behind him. When he left, I sat in the quiet, staring at my hands. They looked thinner than I remembered, but steady. Always steady. I'd spent my life believing Daniel was simply overwhelmed, busy, distracted. I excused the distance, the coldness, the way he spoke to me as if I were someone he'd outgrown. I made up reasons for him, the way mothers do. I never let myself imagine he might choose a path that required me to disappear from it. But everything he'd done here, every word he'd planted in these halls, told a different story. And that story ended with me losing more than a house. Late in the afternoon, a volunteer wheeled me downstairs for imaging. As we passed the lobby, I saw something through the glass doors that made my stomach tighten. Daniel, standing outside on his phone. Calm, upright, talking as if nothing in the world was wrong. He didn't see me. I was too far back in the wheelchair, the volunteer too focused on the hallway ahead. But I watched him. His posture, the casual tilt of his head, the way he smiled slightly as he spoke. The expression of a man who wasn't worried about his mother's health at all. A man who already believed he'd secured whatever he came for. He ended the call and walked toward the parking lot. For a moment, I thought he might come inside, but he didn't. He got into his car and drove away, without even glancing toward the hospital entrance. I felt something settle, deep, irrevocable. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't fear. This wasn't care. This was preparation. And whatever Daniel had prepared for, it involved a life where I wasn't meant to return home. Not on my terms, not with my keys, not as myself. After Daniel drove off, the volunteer wheeled me back to my room, chatting about the weather and the hospital garden, completely unaware that something inside me had shifted. Not broken. No, that had happened earlier. This was different. A quiet, deliberate settling, the way snow falls evenly over the ground, hiding the mess beneath but making the cold impossible to ignore. When I was alone again, I lowered the bed rails myself. My arm trembled a little, but it worked. The small act felt strangely important. I swung my legs to the side, resting my feet on the floor, and sat there until the dizziness faded. The nurse walked in just then, surprised. "Mrs. Hale, let me help you." "I can stand," I said. And I did. It wasn't strength I felt, it was clarity. A kind of inner stillness that comes only when a person stops pretending. I had spent years telling myself that Daniel was stressed, busy, overwhelmed, trying his best. I used the excuses every mother uses when she loves someone more than truth should allow. But now the truth sat beside me like an old acquaintance who had patiently waited for me to open the door. Daniel wasn't trying his best. He was trying to erase mine. When I lay back down, I let my mind wander through the years I had avoided examining too closely. Times he'd dismissed my concerns with a half laugh. Times he'd borrowed money with promises that dissolved in the air. Times he'd spoken to me not as a son, but as a man slightly embarrassed by the woman who raised him. I had blamed myself for that, told myself I'd been too soft, too accommodating, too hopeful. But now I saw something I hadn't allowed myself to consider. Daniel had grown comfortable with the version of me who didn't push back, and a mother who doesn't resist becomes, in some minds, property. Late in the evening, the social worker came again. She tried to mask her hesitation, but I saw it clearly. The uncertainty of someone who no longer trusted the story she'd been given. She asked if I felt up to answering a few questions. "Yes," I said. "I'd like that." She went through her list: memory checks, daily routines, safety concerns. I answered everything plainly, without emotion. When she finished, she folded her hands over her clipboard. "You seem very clear," she said softly. "More clear than your son described." "I am as I've always been," I replied. "My son is the one who has changed." She held my gaze longer than before. "Mrs. Hale, may I ask, do you feel safe going home when you're discharged?" A simple question, but not a simple answer. I nodded, then added, "But I'll need to know exactly what I'm returning to." She hesitated. "We can request a wellness follow-up when you leave, a home check if needed." "Good," I said. "I'll want documentation of everything." Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "Of course." After she left, I stared at the dim glow of the hallway through the crack under my door. I had always been a quiet woman, a patient woman, not fragile, but gentle in ways people misunderstand. Daniel had mistaken that gentleness for weakness. He'd mistaken my trust for permission, and he'd mistaken my silence for surrender. He didn't know me as well as he thought. I thought of my late husband, Henry. He used to say, "Maggie, you're the calmest storm I've ever met. You don't shout, but when you finally speak, everything changes." I hadn't felt like a storm in years, maybe decades, but lying there, my hands folded over the blanket, I felt something return, not anger, not vengeance, just a firm, steady line inside me that would not bend. I wasn't going to let anyone, not even my son, decide who I was. Not while I still recognized myself. Not while my mind remained clear enough to see every piece of what he'd done. And as the hospital lights dimmed for the night, I realized something in the simplest, most undeniable way. This was the last time Daniel would ever speak for me. Whatever happened next, I would make sure of that. The next morning arrived with a kind of sharp clarity, as if someone had wiped the film from the hospital windows overnight. I woke early, before the nurses changed shifts, before the carts rattled down the hallway. The sky outside my window was pale blue, clean and thin, and I felt the same, clean in a way, cleared out. There was nothing left to excuse. A young staff member from administration came in carrying a tablet. She introduced herself as Lila and said they were updating patient records. "We need to document your understanding of your current condition and your discharge expectations," she said. Her tone was neutral, careful, but she wasn't looking at me the way others had. She was evaluating me, not Daniel's words. "Fine," I said. "Let's do that." She asked her questions steadily. I answered each one plainly. Medications, dates, my home address, the events of the past week. When she finished typing, she glanced up at me for a moment longer than necessary. "Mrs. Hale, you're very coherent," she said quietly. "I know," I replied. "I've been coherent every day of my life." There was a pause, a silent acknowledgement that what had been written about me did not match what stood in front of her. She tapped something on her tablet. Would you like to add a personal statement to your record? She asked. Anything you feel needs to be corrected? Yes, I said. I want you to write that I dispute all claims regarding confusion, wandering, or memory lapses. I want it in my file, plainly. She nodded. I'll add that. When she left, the social worker arrived again with a stack of forms. She looked almost relieved to see me sitting upright, alert. There's something you should know, she began, taking the chair beside me. Your son requested to be notified before you're discharged. He asked that we release information to him rather than to you for your own well-being. My well-being. I almost smiled at the phrasing. And what is your policy? I asked. We prioritize the patient, she said gently. You, not your family. But he presented himself as your healthcare proxy. Proxy. The word hit harder than I expected. I never signed anything giving him that authority, I said. I know, she replied. That's why I'm here. We checked. There is no active proxy on file. Legally, you speak for yourself. No one else. I felt the slow, steady drip of relief, measured, not overwhelming. Thank you, I said. She hesitated, then leaned slightly closer. If your son is misrepresenting your condition, we need documentation, for your protection and for ours. I nodded. What exactly do you need? Your statement in writing, she said, and if possible, someone on staff willing to confirm your cognitive clarity. Clarity. I had more of it now than I'd had in years. I'll give you my statement, I said, and I want copies of all notes he added to my chart. She paused. You're entitled to them. I know, I replied. I would like them today. When she left, I stared at the blank form she'd set on my tray. My hand shook slightly when I picked up the pen, not from fear, but from the weight of finally telling the truth without softening it. I wrote slowly, not embellishing a thing. I wrote that I was fully oriented. I wrote that I had never wandered. I wrote that my son had acted without my consent. I wrote that any change in my home locks had been done without my knowledge or approval. I wrote that I feared his intentions, not dramatically, but plainly, the way truth stands without decoration. By the time I finished, my breathing felt steadier. A nurse passed by and noticed the papers. Do you need a witness signature for those? She asked. I'd appreciate it, I said. She read the first few lines and swallowed hard. Mrs. Hale, I've never seen you confused, not once. Then sign, I said quietly. She did. When she left the room, I folded the papers neatly and placed them on my lap. They felt heavier than they should have, like a small shield forged from words. Outside my door, I heard two nurses talking softly. One said, her son told us she wouldn't remember half of what we said. I don't believe that anymore, the other replied. For a moment, I just sat there, listening. Around me, a story had begun to crack. And this time, I wasn't the one being rewritten. The day they told me I was being discharged, the sky outside had turned a muted gray, the kind that makes everything look washed out and distant. A nurse handed me a packet of instructions, and the social worker slipped my signed statements inside a sealed envelope for your records. I held it in my lap while they wheeled me downstairs, the envelope heavier than any suitcase I'd ever packed. It wasn't paper, it was proof. And I had the uneasy feeling I'd need every page. The hospital lobby smelled of disinfectant and cold air. People hurried past with their coats half on. I sat near the sliding doors while the transport aide went to arrange my ride. I didn't call Daniel. I didn't even consider it. He had made sure the hospital believed I wasn't capable of handling my own decisions, but he hadn't expected I'd be walking out with a folder full of his words, recorded in black and white. The aide returned and pushed my wheelchair outside. The air was sharp, almost medicinal. A shuttle van pulled up, the driver lowering the step carefully. "Home?" he asked. "Yes," I said, though the word felt foreign now. As we drove through familiar streets, everything looked almost the same. My grocery store, the park bench where I'd read on warm mornings, the bakery where I bought cinnamon rolls when Daniel visited. Except he hadn't visited much lately. And now I understood why. He'd been spending his time somewhere else, my house, making changes I had never agreed to. When the shuttle stopped in front of my home, I hesitated before stepping out. The yard looked untouched, the hedge trimmed, the maple tree shedding slow leaves onto the walkway. Nothing looked wrong. Nothing looked different. But my eyes kept drifting to the front door. My keys were in my purse, exactly where they'd always been. It was strange how much weight they carried now, little metal pieces that might fit into a lock that no longer belonged to me. I climbed the front steps carefully. The driver waited by the van, and I waved for him to go. I didn't want witnesses. Not for this. I held my breath, slid the key into the lock, and turned. It didn't budge. The resistance was immediate, final, like pushing against someone's back as they held the door shut. I tried again, slower this time, as if gentleness might coax the mechanism into remembering me. But the lock refused. The key was useless. A stranger trying to enter a home that no longer recognized her. A small, cold pulse went through me. Not panic, but something firmer. Something that steadied my spine. I stepped back, looking at the house with new eyes. The curtains were different. My old beige ones had been replaced with deeper colored ones I'd never seen. Someone had been inside long enough to make choices. Someone comfortable enough to act like the owner. I walked along the porch toward the window near the living room. Peering through the glass, I saw boxes stacked neatly near the sofa. My handwriting was on some of the labels. Kitchen drawers, hall closet, master bedroom linens. My things. Packed. Organized. As if I were moving, though I had told no one I planned to move. And there, beside the boxes, was something else. A brochure. Glossy. Bright. A senior living facility 30 minutes away. I knew the place. It presented itself as a resort, but everyone knew it was more of a holding pen, somewhere to place the elderly when convenience outweighed affection. Daniel had left it on the coffee table. My own living room, my own table, my own future, laid out without a single conversation. I placed my hand against the window glass, the cool surface grounding me. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't a mistake. This was deliberate. My son had changed the locks, packed my belongings, and chosen a destination he never intended to discuss with me. I could have cried. A few years ago, I might have. But now there was only a quiet steadiness in me, the kind that comes from understanding exactly where you stand and exactly what you cannot allow. I stepped back from the window, exhaled slowly, and felt the envelope of documents press against my ribs where I'd tucked it inside my coat. He had taken my keys, but I had taken the truth. And with that, the balance between us shifted for the first time in years. I didn't go far, just down the walkway toward Mrs. Carver's house next door. She'd lived there longer than I had, sharp as a needle even at 81. I didn't plan to knock. I only needed to walk, to breathe, to let the cold air settle my thoughts. But she spotted me before I reached the end of the fence. "Maggie," she called from her porch, pulling her shawl tighter. "You're home already? I thought your son said—" She stopped herself, but not quickly enough. I stepped closer. What exactly did Daniel say? She hesitated, her eyes darting toward my house, then back to me. Well, he told us you were being moved, that you'd taken a turn. He said you wouldn't be back for a while. Maybe ever. The words floated between us, soft but heavy. Did he say why? I asked. Mrs. Carver pursed her lips. Only that you needed full-time supervision, and that he'd be handling the house until everything was settled. Handling the house. Such a clean phrase for something so cruel. Her voice softened. I didn't believe him, Maggie. You've been clearer than most folks I know. I nodded. Did you see him here recently? Oh, yes, she said. He came by 2 days in a row. Had a handyman with him. They carried boxes out to the garage, and he mentioned repainting the living room. I told him I liked the old color, but he said, well, he said it wasn't really your place anymore. My place. Not my place anymore. I felt the truth settle deeper, not like a blow, but like a stone, placed exactly where Daniel meant it to land. Mrs. Carver reached out and touched my arm. I'm sorry, dear. I didn't mean to upset you. You didn't, I said. But thank you for telling me. She studied me for a moment. You going inside? No, I answered. Not today. The lock made the decision for me. I thanked her again and walked back toward the street. The cold wind tugged at my coat, and my body felt both too light and too heavy, the way one feels after waking from a long, unsettling dream that turns out to be real. I stood in front of my house for a long time, memorizing the small shifts, new curtains, boxes moved, decisions made without me. Daniel hadn't just changed the lock. He'd changed the narrative of my life in this neighborhood. He'd told people his version first, so mine would sound like denial when I finally spoke. But I kept hearing Henry's old voice in my mind. You're quiet, Maggie. But quiet isn't weak. I wasn't going to argue with Daniel in a doorway that no longer opened. I wasn't going to beg for entry. I wasn't going to shout on the porch like a woman losing her grip. I would go about this the right way, the steady way, the way that holds. The documents in my coat pressed against me as if reminding me I wasn't powerless. I turned away from the house and began walking, not quickly, but with purpose, toward the main road, where taxis passed every half hour. My steps were slow, careful, but each one felt stronger than the last. If Daniel had built a plan while I was in that hospital bed, then he'd forgotten one thing. I was no longer lying down, and I had just begun to stand back up. The taxi dropped me off in front of a modest brick building with a small blue sign, Law Offices of Turner and Wynn. I had been here once years ago when Henry and I updated our wills. I remembered the quiet of the waiting room, the faint smell of paper and old carpet, and the firm handshake of Mr. Turner. He was older now, much older, but when his receptionist brought me in, he stood the moment he saw me. Mrs. Hale, he said, concern flickering across his face. You look like you've had a difficult week. You could say that, I answered, settling slowly into the chair across from his desk. I need help, and I need it documented. He nodded. Tell me everything. So I did. Not with dramatics, not with tears, just truth laid out plainly. The hospital stay, the lies Daniel told, the orientation notes, the changed locks, the boxes I'd seen through my own window. Mr. Turner listened without interrupting, his brows tightening little by little. When I finished, he removed his glasses and let out a long, slow breath. Mrs. Hale, your son has taken steps that can't be ignored. Whether his motive is financial or control, or both, he's acting without authority. And making false claims about your competency, that's serious. I want to protect myself, I said. Legally, permanently. Good, he replied. Let's start with revoking any implied authority. We'll draft a statement declaring you fully competent to manage your affairs. I'll also request your hospital records. Having documentation of the misrepresentation will help. I reached into my coat and handed him the sealed envelope the social worker had given me. These are the notes he submitted to the staff. He read the first page, his mouth tightening. This is intentional, he said quietly. Not a misunderstanding. I felt no need to respond. I already knew. Next, he pulled out forms, thick ones, for reinstating full financial and medical autonomy. Your son cannot speak for you, he said firmly, and you need to make that indisputable. As he guided me through each signature line, I felt something loosen inside me. Not relief, no, Daniel's shadow still sat somewhere behind me, but a kind of grounding. Every page I signed felt like reclaiming a part of myself he'd tried to take. When we finished, Mr. Turner leaned forward. There's something else to consider. If your son changed your locks without consent, that can be viewed as unlawful interference with property. If he removed your belongings, that becomes even more serious. I nodded slowly. I need access to my home. You will have it, he said. We'll arrange for a sheriff's escort. You shouldn't return alone. His words landed with a kind of finality I hadn't expected. The idea of walking back into the house with someone official beside me felt strange, but not frightening. Frightening was standing on that porch earlier, trying a key I'd used for decades and feeling it do nothing at all. Before I left, he said one more thing. Mrs. Hale, whatever your son is planning, you're ahead of him now. You've acted quickly and clearly. That matters. On my way out, the receptionist offered to call a cab, but I told her I preferred to walk a bit. The air outside was crisp, and each step felt deliberate, like my body was relearning its own authority. For years, I'd let Daniel move pieces of my life around, thinking it was easier not to challenge him. But this attempt to remove me from my own home had drawn a clear line. I wasn't stepping over it. I was standing on it. And for the first time in a long time, I felt the ground hold steady beneath me. I waited until evening to call Daniel, not out of fear, and not because I needed time to think. I already knew what I was going to say. I waited because I wanted my voice steady, my breath even, my heart calm. I wanted him to hear a mother he didn't recognize anymore. When I finally pressed his number, it rang longer than usual. He answered with a breathless rush, the way people do when they pretend they're busy. Mom, I heard you were discharged. Why didn't you let me pick you up? I managed, I said. A pause, thin, uncertain. You should have called. I was worried. He wasn't, and I didn't respond to the lie. Instead, I said, I went to the house. Another silence, this time heavier. Oh, well, I thought we'd talk about that when you were stronger. I'm strong enough now. He cleared his throat. Mom, I didn't want you stressing about things. The house needed organizing, and the locks, well, after your episode. I didn't have an episode, I said quietly. And you know that. He exhaled loudly, annoyed. The doctor said you were confused. No, I corrected. You said that. The doctor simply repeated it. He didn't like that. I heard it in the quick shift of his tone. Look, Mom, I'm trying to help you. You're getting older. You forget things. You wander. It's not safe for you to live alone anymore. It was almost astonishing, the ease with which he said it, as if the lie had become comfortable on his tongue. I've never wandered, I said. You don't remember. Calmly, I replied, Daniel, I remember everything, including what you told the staff. He paused again. They misunderstood me. No, I said. They documented you. He sucked in a breath, a small, sharp sound. Documented? Yes, and I've seen it. For a moment, he didn't speak. I imagined him standing somewhere in his apartment, holding the phone tighter, his mind racing through possibilities he hadn't planned for. Mom, he said finally, shifting to that soft, coaxing tone he'd used as a teenager when he wanted money. You're overreacting. I was thinking of your future. You need a safer environment, a place with support. A place like the brochure on my coffee table? He froze. I didn't hear the words, only the quiet shock on the line. You went inside? He asked sharply. No, I answered. I looked through the window, through my window, at my boxes. He inhaled through his teeth. I was just organizing. You have too much stuff lying around. You trip easily. I'm trying to prevent an accident. By removing me from my home? That house is too much for you, he snapped. You can't keep up with it. It's time to face reality. I am facing reality, I said, my voice even. You're the one avoiding it. What does that mean? It means I've spoken to an attorney and the hospital, and I've revoked any implied authority you think you have. The line went dead silent. Then he laughed, short, dismissive. Mom, come on. You don't understand the paperwork. You always get overwhelmed. Not anymore. His voice tightened. You're making mistakes. Big ones. We need to talk in person. No, I said. We don't. You can't do this, he said sharply. I already have. For a moment, all I heard was his breathing, fast, uneven. Then he lowered his voice, as if someone were listening. You're being manipulated, he whispered. Someone's filling your head with nonsense. No, I said. Someone tried to empty my life of me, and I stopped him. He didn't respond. Good night, Daniel, I said, and I ended the call, not waiting for whatever explanation he would invent next. My hands didn't shake. My breath didn't tremble. And as I set the phone down, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Control. Not over him. Over myself. 2 days later, I found myself standing beside a county sheriff on my front porch, the morning light sharp against the newly polished lock Daniel had installed. Mr. Turner had arranged everything. Papers filed, statements documented, the request for official accompaniment approved. Even so, when the sheriff knocked on the door, my breath tightened in my chest. The house remained silent. No footsteps, no movement. Not even the hum of the old refrigerator I'd heard through these walls for decades. Ma'am, the sheriff said, you're the legal owner. We'll proceed. He handed me one of the documents to hold, more for formality than anything. His presence was steady, an anchor I didn't know I needed. Let's check around back, he said. We walked along the side of the house. The grass brushed my shoes, and I felt an odd sensation. Something between nostalgia and estrangement. A strange thing to walk beside your own home and feel like a visitor. When we reached the back door, the sheriff tried his master key. It didn't fit. He gave a quiet grunt. Your son changed every lock, he said. I nodded. I know. Without permission, that's unlawful interference. You'll want that in your report. I do, I said. He radioed dispatch to confirm we were authorized to enter by forced means if necessary. When the approval came, he looked at me. We'll try one more time before damage. He knocked again. Firm, controlled. Sheriff's Department. If anyone's inside, announce yourself. Nothing. He stepped back, braced himself, and with one solid motion, forced the latch enough to slip the door open. It wasn't dramatic, just a quiet surrender of a lock that had no right to exist. He held the door for me. Mrs. Hale, this is your home. You go first. I stepped inside. The smell was wrong. That was the first thing I noticed. My house always smelled faintly of lavender and warm wood. Now it smelled like paint, cardboard, and someone else's idea of cleanliness. Boxes lined the hallway, stacked with precision. Some sealed, some open. Inside one, I saw my photo albums. Every decade of my life placed almost carelessly on top of winter scarves. Another box held my dishes wrapped in newspaper. And another, my books. The ones I'd collected slowly over years of quiet afternoons. It felt like walking into a life already halfway erased. The sheriff walked behind me, noting everything. "He did a lot of packing," he said quietly. "Yes," I replied. "He planned for me not to return." We moved into the living room. The curtains were new, deep blue instead of cream. My rug had been rolled. A measuring tape lay across the coffee table, right beside the brochure for the senior facility. The sheriff picked it up, glanced at it, then looked at me with a kind of restrained sympathy. "He was preparing to relocate you." "I know," I said again. My voice didn't break. I surprised even myself. He documented the scene with photos, careful and methodical. "Do you want me to call your son to notify him you've regained entry?" "No," I said immediately. "That call will come from my attorney." He nodded. "Good. Better that way." I walked farther inside, touching the edge of my dining table. It was the same table where Daniel had blown out candles as a child, where Henry had read his newspaper every Sunday, where I had folded quilts late into quiet nights. And someone had nearly decided those moments belonged in storage. "Mrs. Hale," the sheriff said gently, "you're safe now. He can't lock you out again." I turned to him, my hand still on the table. "He tried to take my place in this house." "But he didn't succeed," he replied. I looked around at the half-packed rooms, the stripped-down walls, the evidence of a life paused without my permission. "No," I said softly, "not anymore." And for the first time since returning home, I breathed fully. The sheriff stayed while I walked through each room, slow and deliberate. It wasn't grief I felt. It was something quieter, something that settled behind my ribs like a weight that would not shift. My home had been touched by hands that didn't love it. That was the part that stung the most. Not the boxes, not the new curtains, but the absence of care. Daniel hadn't packed my life out of sorrow or necessity. He'd packed it out of convenience. Once the sheriff finished his photographs, he turned to me. "Your attorney will receive the report within a few hours," he said. "You'll have full documentation that your son altered the locks and interfered with your property." "Thank you," I said, and I meant it. He left after reminding me to call if Daniel attempted to enter without permission. The door closed behind him, and suddenly the house felt too still. Not silent, still, an in-between kind of quiet, a quiet waiting to see what I would do next. I walked to the kitchen, opened a cabinet out of habit, and found it empty. Boxes had swallowed nearly all of it. My dishes, my mugs, even the old ceramic bowl Henry had bought at a flea market 30 years ago. The one with the tiny crack that looked like a thin smile. I found it in a box labeled fragile, wrapped in newspaper that left gray smudges on my fingertips. I touched the bowl's chipped edge. A small, ordinary thing. But it felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. I spent the next hour unsealing boxes, not unpacking fully, just looking, touching, restoring the order in my mind. It was important to know what he had tried to move, important to see what he thought could be taken without consequence. Around noon, my phone rang. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, it rang again, this time with my lawyer's name on the screen. "Mrs. Hale," Mr. Turner said. I've received the sheriff's preliminary notes. They're very clear. There will be no doubt that your son acted without legal authority. I'm glad, I replied. My voice didn't tremble. It felt anchored. There's more, he continued. I've also reviewed the hospital documentation you provided. Based on your statements and the staff's corrections, we can establish misrepresentation on his part. If he attempts to pursue guardianship, he won't succeed. I exhaled slowly, not relief exactly, but confirmation of something I already knew in my bones. Thank you, I said. I want you to be aware, he added gently, that Daniel may react strongly once he understands he no longer controls the narrative. I expect he will. And if he shows up at the house, I'll call the sheriff. There was a pause, respectful, approving. Good. After I hung up, I stood in the hallway, the phone still warm in my hand. The house looked different now, not because the curtains were wrong or the boxes were out of place, but because I no longer felt like an intruder. This was my space, my history, my life. It didn't matter who had touched it in my absence. I walked into the living room and sat on the bare sofa. The cushions were gone, boxed naturally, but the frame held me just the same. I looked at the brochure still lying on the table and picked it up. A cheerful photograph of older adults smiling at a fake pond stared back at me. Daniel had imagined me there, sitting quietly, tucked away, no longer interfering with whatever plans he had for my house, my finances, my absence. I folded the brochure in half, then in half again, until it was a small, tight square. Not my future. Not ever. And as I set it in the trash bin beside me, I felt, for the first time, something close to peace. Late that afternoon, when the house had settled into its familiar creaks and small sighs, I made myself a cup of tea using the one mug Daniel hadn't boxed, a plain white one with a faint chip along the rim. I held it carefully as I sat near the window, letting the warmth ease the ache in my hands. The sky outside was beginning to dim, fading into that soft bluish gray I'd always liked. I wasn't expecting anyone. I was certain of that. So when a gentle knock sounded, I felt a moment of stillness inside me. Not fear, just wonder at who could possibly be on the other side. When I opened the door, my granddaughter stood there. Emily, 17, taller than I remembered, with that same thoughtful posture she'd had since childhood. She held her backpack with both hands, like she wasn't sure whether she was staying or leaving. "Grandma," she said quietly, "can I come in?" For a second, I couldn't speak. I simply stepped aside. She slipped past me, her eyes moving slowly over the boxes, the new curtains, the shifted spaces. She didn't comment. She didn't pretend it looked normal. And for that, I felt something in my chest soften. "I went to the house," she said, turning toward me. "Dad told me you weren't coming back. But then I called the hospital, and they said you'd been discharged days ago." She swallowed hard. "So I knew something wasn't right." I sat down on the edge of a chair, watching her. "What did your father tell you exactly?" She hesitated. "That you were declining. That you couldn't live alone. That you were confused and needed more help than he could give." I didn't flinch. I'd heard it all before, just from different mouths. "And you believed him?" I asked gently. "No," she said. Her voice didn't waver. "I believed you." She set her backpack down and joined me at the table. In that moment, her face looked so young and so unbearably kind that it tightened my throat in a way nothing Daniel had done ever could. "I saw the boxes," she said, "and the brochure." Her jaw clenched slightly. "He didn't tell me he was planning to move you." "He didn't tell me either," I replied. She nodded, as if she'd expected that answer. Grandma, what do you want to do? I mean, truly. Not what he wants. I looked at her, this girl with her grandmother's eyes and her father's stubborn chin, and felt something shift again, but in a different direction this time. Not toward anger, toward connection. I said slowly, to live in my own home, on my own terms. And I want the truth written down so no one can rewrite it again. Emily reached across the table, her hand resting lightly on mine. Her grip was warm, steady. I'm here, she said. Whatever you need. I'm not going anywhere. A simple promise, but it felt like a pillar placed under a part of me that had been leaning too long. She walked with me through the house afterward, opening boxes, asking where things belonged. Not trying to fix anything, just trying to understand what had been done. When she found the photo album of her father as a little boy, she traced the edge of the cover with her fingertip. He wasn't always like this, she whispered. No, I said. He wasn't. We didn't talk about blame. We didn't talk about repair. That wasn't what the moment needed. It was enough that she was there, seeing the truth with her own eyes, not Daniel's version, not the hospital's assumptions, but the quiet reality of a woman standing in her own living room after being pushed aside. When she finally left that evening, she hugged me tightly. Call me tomorrow, she said. I mean it. I will, I answered. And as the door closed behind her, the house no longer felt quite so still, not quite so emptied. A small warmth lingered in the room, like the faint glow left after a candle is blown out. Not a flame, but the promise of one. The morning after Emily's visit, I woke with a steadier breath. Not lighter, no. The last week had left too many marks for lightness, but clearer. I made tea, sat at the kitchen table and looked at the scattered papers Mr. Turner had given me. Legal language always felt like a cold hallway, long, echoing, full of closed doors. But this time, I wasn't intimidated. These weren't doors meant to shut me out. They were doors I was choosing to open. Around 10, Mr. Turner called. His tone was brisk but kind. Mrs. Hale, everything is prepared. If you're ready, we can finalize the trust documents today. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. I'm ready. The trust wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about punishing Daniel or proving anything to him. It was about something far quieter. Security. The kind that comes from knowing no one can move you like a pawn again. The kind that comes from drawing a boundary and saying, this is as far as you go. At the office, Mr. Turner guided me through each form. A trust isn't complicated when you strip away the formal language. It simply says, these assets are mine, and they will be used how I choose. No one else dictates their fate. And your beneficiary? He asked gently. Emily, I said without hesitation. He made a note. Any involvement from your son? No, none at all. He didn't ask why, he understood. When I signed the final page, he slid the folder toward me. This protects you, not just financially, legally, emotionally, even practically. Your son will not be able to sell your house, move you, or make claims on your behalf. It was strange how quiet the moment felt. No triumph, no swelling pride. Just a slow release, like setting down a weight I'd been carrying without knowing how heavy it had become. On my way home, I asked the driver to stop a block early. I wanted to walk the last stretch alone. The air was cool, the kind that carries the faint smell of pine from the houses down the street. I passed Mrs. Carver's porch. She waved, and I lifted my hand gently in return. I wondered how much she suspected. Maybe everything. Older women often see more than they're told. When I reached my house, I paused at the gate, The new lock still gleamed on the door, uninformed of its own defeat. But seeing it no longer triggered the same sharp pang. It was just metal now, metal that would come off soon enough. Inside, the boxes remained where Daniel had left them, but the house felt different. Not because anything had changed, but because I had. I gave myself a moment in each room, not to grieve what he'd tried to take, but to remember what he hadn't managed to reach. In the bedroom, I touched the top of my dresser, the familiar grain of the wood warm under my fingertips. In the hallway, I ran my hand along the wall where Henry once leaned to kiss my temple on his way out the door. In the living room, I looked at the empty spot where my rug had been rolled up and placed in a corner. I could put it all back, every piece, slowly, on my own timeline. As I stood there, the phone rang. "Emily, Grandma, you okay?" "Yes," I said. "I am. Did you sign everything?" "I did." She exhaled into the receiver, a soft, relieved sound. "Good, really good." We talked for a few minutes about school, her upcoming exam, her worry that her father would be upset. I didn't tell her she might be right. I didn't tell her he might come to the house. There was no reason to pass fear forward. After we said goodbye, I set the phone down and looked around again. This house, my house, felt like a place I could inhabit fully again, without apology or permission. Daniel had moved pieces of my life as if they were chessmen, but I had moved the board. The next morning came quietly, the way good mornings often do. I woke before the sun, pulled on my robe, and walked through the house without turning on a single light. I wanted to feel it as it was, its real shape, its familiar shadows, its patient stillness. A home remembers you if you let it, even after someone tries to empty it out. In the kitchen, I boiled water and made tea in the chipped mug. I carried it to the living room and sat near the window, watching the first stretch of pale light touch the tops of the trees. For the first time in weeks, my shoulders softened. Not because everything was fixed. Nothing in life fixes neatly. But because the ground beneath me was mine again. Later that morning, Mr. Turner called to confirm the trust had been officially recorded. "Your son has no legal standing over your home or finances," he said. "Everything is secured exactly as you chose." I thanked him, though the words felt small compared to the weight of what he'd helped me reclaim. After the call, I stayed seated a long while, letting the quiet settle in. This was not triumph. It was steadiness, the kind I'd forgotten I could feel. Daniel never came by the house. Not that day, not the next. Perhaps he was angry, perhaps embarrassed. Perhaps he was deciding how to rewrite the story again. That was his burden now, not mine. I didn't owe him a confrontation, or forgiveness, or an explanation. Some distances grow for a reason. Some doors, once closed, stay closed, because they were never meant to protect the person on the outside. In the afternoon, Emily stopped by with a small bag of groceries. She didn't fuss. She didn't ask too many questions. She simply put milk in the fridge, apples in the bowl, and then made herself comfortable on the couch, as if we'd always spent our days like this. I realized how much I'd missed being spoken to without caution or pity. "You're different," she said quietly. "How so?" "You look steady, like you're back in your own skin." I smiled. "I suppose I am." We talked about her classes, her plans after graduation, the new book she was reading. No discussion of Daniel. No need. She knew the truth now, and truth doesn't require rehearsal. When she left, she kissed my cheek and said, "Call me if you need anything, even if it's just company." And I believed her. That was the change. I believed her. The house grew quiet again after she walked out, but it wasn't the hollow quiet from before. It was a gentler one, like a warm breath held between moments. I stood in the doorway a long time, looking out at the yard, the street, the place I still belonged to. Daniel had counted on confusion, on weakness, on silence. Instead, he met clarity, resolve, and a voice that refused to disappear. I walked back inside, closed the door, and let the latch settle into place. My lock, on my terms. Sometimes survival isn't loud. Sometimes justice isn't sharp. Sometimes the strongest thing a woman can do is simply stay standing exactly where someone tried to erase her. And if you're reading this, if any piece of this echoes inside you, remember this for yourself. Don't let anyone speak for you. Don't let anyone write your story. And never hand over the key to a life you're still living.